the way we live our lives. And henceforth, they will draw all these verses would be taken into from an environmental perspective. So that's some of the verses from the Quran. Another perspective that they talk about is the idea of Khalifa. Okay, this is one of the bigger ones too. What I've talked about before, Mizan, quickly, balance. Okay, earth for human, not just human beings, but animals. And then another concept is Khalifa, or Caliph, you could say. Okay, and that is someone who is the caretaker, okay, or vicegerent. And human beings were supposed to be the Khalifa, or the caretaker of the earth, and not only the earth, meaning the species on it, the animals and the soil and everything else. So they're supposed to be there. Their job is to take care of them and not destroy it. Okay, and that is one of the reasons why this is how Muslims look at it and say, well, if we're going to do it, we have to really make laws and protect the environment, because that's a duty. That's a divine duty on believers, on Muslims. So, hence, therefore, if you have EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, in the Islamic world, the Muslim world, they're going to look at it from these sources that they're going to, and this is what the Quran's talking. And there are many other principles that the Quranic or Islamic ethics is based on. Going back to these scholars, and these are some of the names. I just handpicked them. Scholars in Islamic environmental ethics, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, he actually talked about the environmental crisis back in 1966 in his book, Man and Nature, The Spiritual Crisis in Modern Man. And basically what he's talking about is this whole concept of mizan that we've talked about, that we're out of balance. And how we could see we're out of balance is because of the spiritual crisis in the materialistic society. Okay, that people are really at loss. And then this is how he goes by, that people could actually take care of nature when they are in sync with the spiritual world or spiritual norms. Okay, and that's really the crisis of the modern man, that he does not understand God and environment, so therefore he doesn't care, that it's a sacred responsibility. Rather than that, he simply sees the value and how much I could make out of this, whether it's timber industry or any other industry. He also wrote some of the other works that he has and articles, Religion and Order of Nature, Islam and Environmental Crisis. So you could see the dates, 1994, 1992, The Ecological Problem in the Light of Sufism. Again, he's giving you more spiritual perspective. Okay, he's giving you more religious perspective. And then you have scholars such as Richard Foltz. He had a wonderful book, anthology on Islam and ecology, the last one, A Bestowed Trust. A lot of good articles that have been put together. And he talks about one of his forte, environmentalism in the Muslim world. He actually went and wrote a lot about what's happening in the Muslim world with regards to practical environmental or environmentalism, practical steps in safeguarding and protecting the environment. Also, he talks about worldviews, religion, and the environment. Is there an Islamic environmentalism? Okay, and a lot of people confuse the term environmental science with Islamic environmental science. Just because we were talking about Islamic environmental ethics, there is no such thing as Islamic environmental science. Environmental science is environmental science. It has no religious background to it. Just like physics, we're not going to come up with a Christian physics and Buddhist physics or Buddhist biology. And so when it comes to ethics, we could define that ethics as, because it's based on Islamic sources, therefore you have Islamic environmental ethics. But when it comes to science, there is no such thing as Islamic environmental science. Okay. Next one, please. Mawil Izzuddin, he's from Samarra, one of the islands in East Asia. He actually did a lot of work on environmental ethics pertaining to Islam, and he did a lot of research in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia and countries in Far East Asia. A lot of good stuff about Islamic environmental ethics, law, and society. Another author is Khalid Fazlun. He wrote mostly from the sources. A lot of what happened in the 80s and 90s with regards to Islamic environmental ethics, scholars actually went back into the Quran and the Hadith, right? The Sunnah, what we talked about. Those two. What is Quran? The direct revelation in one book. What is Hadith? Hadiths are scattered sayings of the Prophet or statements about the Prophet in the books put together by different scholars. So there are a lot of books of Hadith. It's not just one book. More than at least 20, 30 books. Okay. So there are a lot of books, different books, where all these hadiths or all these events have been mentioned, all these statements of the Prophet. For example, one of the time, the Prophet was with his companions, and one of the companion, he went into the nest and he grabbed some chicks from the I think there were sparrows or some birds, and he brought them with him. And the Prophet, he saw that somebody has done something because he saw the bird, the mother, flying on top in circle. So he went back to his companions, his friends, and he says, who has harmed this bird or caused it to be anxious? Because they have taken the chicks from the nest. So he told them to return those back where they belong or where they were supposed to be. And that, kind of brings it back to when we're talking about Islamic environmental ethics. This was the command of the Prophet Muhammad to the Muslims, that one should not engage into or look into simply for the pleasure. The Prophet actually forbade hunting for pleasure. So unless you're going to eat, you're not supposed to play games. It's actually considered forbidden, haram, if you look into fiqh when we talk about shooting animals for just simply mere sports that you go out there and say, okay, if I could go out and do duck hunting, okay, you're not supposed to do that. It's actually forbidden in the religion, unless you're going to shoot it and plan on eating it. Okay, other than that, there's no wasting food, and that's part of the Islamic environmental ethics. And so this is where the scholars are drawing their Islamic ethics from, environmental ethics from. And so 80s and 90s, 1980s, 1990s, up to 2000, I would say, many of these scholars, they were simply going back into the Quran, and they were going back into the Hadith, and just picking out the ones that really applied to environmental ethics. And they put these sources together, and then they said, this is how we're going to look into it. So when they looked into Quran, they came up with these principles. Do not disturb the balance. The earth's created for other than human needs and wants. Okay, protect the birds. All these things. One of these statements of the Prophet ﷺ was about he saw a beast that was burdened with more than what it could bear, and he actually called the owner of that. I forget if it was a camel or what type of or donkey, but he actually called the owner, and he told him that, would you like to be burdened with something more than you could bear? And he simply told him to, relieve the beast and not to do that to the animal. So from these traditions, Muslims are putting together all these sources that this is how it applies to our environmental ethics, our crisis that we're going through. And then after that period, a lot of what these scholars have done in late 90s and early 2000s is that they're actually going more into the law aspect of the environmental ethics. What is the law aspect? That is related to what we talked about before, after Quran, Hadith, the fiqh aspect. And fiqh is jurisprudence. Okay, it's a big word. but that's an English